Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Lost Voice Radio, where we seek to recover the lost voice of Socrates, of common sense that was spoken to him over 2,000 years ago in Athens. I'm John Studi, and along with Jacob Nelson, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on Thomas and technology. And today we're going to be talking quite a bit about reproductive technology and other biotech that is coming into the forefront of our news every single day. It's becoming a more and more popular topic within the field of ethics, and there's a number of issues that we'll be talking about today that are hotly debated. But before we get there, we have, as always, believe that we ought to speak about general principles before we get into specifics, so that way the principles illuminate the truth of the specifics. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Jake, who is our resident moral theologian. Go ahead, Jake.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a great resident moral theologian, but my degree in theology was focused on pastoral theology, so we dealt a lot with just people's lives and how do you apply theology and all that. So, I mean, there's a moral tint to basically everything that I did with a wonderful Institute of Pastoral Theology through Ave Maria University. We're looking at technology today and how the faith applies, how philosophy applies to technology. And I think the first thing to understand that's really important is that technology itself is not good or evil. It's how it is used. I was kind of racking my brain before we started the show, and I couldn't think of a specific technology that is inherently evil in itself. We'll talk about things like contraception, and contraception is inherently evil, but the technology that makes it, that is medicine, is not evil in and of itself. It's how it's used, and the product being contraception is inherently evil. So I was trying to think of different technologies, generally speaking, that are inherently evil. I couldn't think of one. I don't know if you can, John. I don't. I mean, usually it's the product of the technology that's evil.
And the intent of the use, yeah.
Yeah. But that brings us to basically a really concise bit of moral theology in which to jump from, and that's the idea of the human act versus an act of man. So an act of man is just like, say, breathing. You don't deliberate about it. You don't really choose it. It's something that you do as a human person, but it's not something that engages your intellect and will. And so we can have an act of man, and those acts of man are morally indifferent because we're not engaging the intellect and will. We're not choosing it. So it's not like if you hold your breath that you're somehow doing some moral evil. Even though you're keeping air from your body, you're lacking in the body, but that's not a moral issue because there's not the engagement of your intellect and will. And now, if you're like purposely trying to suffocate yourself, that would be a moral issue because you've deliberated about it, at least to some degree, and you've chosen it and that kind of thing.
And I've seen kids do this too, where they want something so bad, they tell us they're going to hold their breath, and they're going to hold their breath, and they go ahead and pass out.
Oh, I thought you were going to go the route of like some stupid game kids are playing today where like...
Oh my gosh.
Don't they put bags over their heads?
No, what we called it when I was a kid was torpedoing. I don't know why it was called torpedoing, but you'd bend over, you put your butt up against the wall, you bend over, put your hands on your knees, and you breathe in and out and out and out, and out until you felt really dizzy. And then you'd go back, and you'd actually put your palms on your throat and squeeze until you passed out. I couldn't believe it. We did it a lot, and it wasn't until my brother-in-law saw us do it when I was like 15 that we stopped, because my brother looked like he died. It was terrifying. And Micah had a good long talk with us about how we don't want to damage our brains because we use those.
Well, at that point you weren't. But
at that point I wasn't, but someday I might want to make use of my cognitive faculties.
I think there's a game out there, though, that teenagers are playing where they'll, like, put a bag over their head and breathe and see who can last the longest before they pass out or something. Like, teenagers come up with some pretty stupid games, so it wouldn't shock me.
They can't be. Yeah, it's not shocking.
But anyway, a human act engages your intellect and your will, and so a human act is what we're morally responsible for, morally culpable for, and that human act has three parts. So there's an object, an intention, and a circumstance. So the object is just simply the thing done. The intention is the end in view, and the circumstance literally means what stands around. So it's all the things around it. So if you want to draw a diagram for yourself at home, draw a little dot on a piece of paper, that's your object. And then an arrow pointing away from that. So that's the end towards which the object is directed. And then a circle around the whole thing, and that's your circumstance. So try if that helps you get a little visual of how these interplay.
I think we need to make this a TV show. It's kind of like a Bob Ross thing, except more theology.
And if we mess up, we can paint a little bush there to hide the error.
Right, yeah. Kind of like how Adam and Eve hid behind plants to hide their error.
Yeah, well, TV show is our next endeavor. Although I don't think either one of us have the faces for TV. I don't think we even have the faces for radio, to be honest.
I do, but for me, it'd be more like the TV show Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Or what about that magician show where he revealed all the secrets, but he wore this black mask the whole time?
Ooh, yeah. We could do that. We could reveal all the secrets of ancient and medieval philosophy that have been held from us for centuries.
Well, we'll put you on the TV. I don't have a face even for radio, so we'll move on from there. But the human act, again, engages your intellect and your will, and it includes the object, the intention, and the circumstance. So perhaps we can just say a human act of, say, driving, the object of, like, getting in your car and moving. And then that object, the objective thing you're doing, is oriented towards some end. Say, going to visit my best buddy, Studi.
Aww.
You know, driving over to Studi's house. And the circumstance around that is, you know, if there's rush hour, if there's not rush hour, if I have gas, I don't have gas, if I'm driving a truck or whatever. All the other information is part of that circumstantial area. And the reason why the circumstance comes into play is that can increase or decrease your culpability. And so, you know, if I get in an accident, it's not rush hour, like nothing's going on in life, I'm just kind of going on a little joyride, and I get in an accident, my culpability is probably higher than if I'm rushing my pregnant wife to the hospital because she's in labor. The circumstance then is that she needs to get to the hospital in order to give birth to my forthcoming son, which is awesome. We just found out we're having a boy, so Studi's kid will be excited. But then my culpability for that accident will be lessened because I'm under duress of trying to get to the hospital.
Right, and that's one of the things I've found fascinating about being about engaging in a more classical Christian understanding of ethics, whereas before my understanding was that there's right or wrong, and it's absolute, and it's, you know, regardless of circumstance, right is right, wrong is wrong, and there's only like one particular order in which things go. But especially after reading some of Aristotle, he even talks about in the Ethics where virtue, he says virtue is relative, and it's like, what? How could he even say that? And more or less, it comes down to these kind of situations, like what is the circumstance? What is the person's need in terms of where do they need to grow in virtue? And
with virtue, even the natural ability, your natural disposition, and so some virtues are more valuable to you than they are to me.
You're right. Yeah, that's absolutely true too. But like you're saying, I love that example of your wife is pregnant and you're trying to get to the hospital, so you run a red light or whatever. Under normal circumstances, you shouldn't run the red light. But
and it's still wrong in this circumstance, but my level of guilt is just less.
Yeah. And so that's where I'm really fascinated and love this idea of a hierarchy of goods that we ought to follow.
Yeah.
Which is where I was having a conversation with somebody a couple days ago on the internet about the natural ends of sexuality and about how sex, if you just look at it from a very objective standpoint, it has the ends of being procreative and unitive. And unity has all those things like mutual comfort of spouses, it's pleasurable,
The release of oxytocin.
Oxytocin, all that kind of stuff. And he was saying, well, then why are we saying that reproduction is the principal end, and relegating the unit of function of sexuality to a lower end? And I said, well, isn't it obvious? I mean, the reason why we have these pleasurable feelings with sex is it encourages us to procreate more. Maybe even think about this in a purely naturalistic standpoint. If a species is given, if a species needs to reproduce and it's given lots of pleasurable feelings, lots of connections, especially with animals such as us, such as ourselves, that we have a need for families to raise children, and if there's a bonding experience between the parents at the physiological level, then it makes it more likely for us to be motivated to stay with that family and raise the children so that our offspring are more well taken care of and have better outcomes for their own lives. And so when I said this to him, we didn't have anything in response. It's just when we're looking at the sexual act or almost anything else, there is still a hierarchy of goods that we need to be aware of in order to rightly understand our actions. And that's one of the things you're talking about here. Yeah, it's good for us not to run a light, but another example is your dad's having a heart attack in the passenger seat. He's going to die.
Right.
You're not taking the 3-4 minutes that's going to take.
Hold on, Dad. We'll be there in a few minutes.
All right. All right, Padre. It's all right. Dad? Dad? You're just sleeping, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so your father's life matters more than not running that red light, particularly if there's nobody coming.
Right. And yeah, this hierarchy of goods is fascinating to me on the converse side as well. This has been a theme that's come up several times in my life and counseling people and doing other things in the last probably month and a half. But even in the realm of evil, that sometimes Satan doesn't want to get us to do evil things. Sometimes he's satisfied to get us to choose good things when we could have chosen better things. And so it's really fascinating with this as well in that we need to recognize a hierarchy of good. It's good to be nourished and to eat, even within a realm of reason, not falling into gluttony and things of this nature. And maybe Satan is going to tempt us with certain foods when the higher good for any particular reason that day might be for us to fast. We're choosing then the natural good over the supernatural good. Both things are good, but he's satisfied in keeping us from the higher good too. And that's not to say we should see Satan under every rock or every action, but it's really fascinating that when we start getting into the idea of a hierarchy of goods, which is really important when we look at technology, because technology can be used for an infinite amount of ends, that we need to deliberate about the ends we're working towards.
One thing I think is funny, just to kind of bounce off of that idea, I think it was St. Therese Lisieux who talked about how one of the devil's tactics is to, like when we're about to undertake a spiritual work or a journey, or we're coming up on Lent, we're in Holy Week now, in terms of our recording schedule. And one of the things St. Therese Lisieux talks about is how the devil often tempts us to do too much in our own works, with our prayers, with our spiritual devotions, with our intellectual endeavors, with our apostolic work. And it gets to the point where we burn ourselves out, we overload ourselves. I mean, somebody who just came into the faith and has never had any prior training might not want to dive deeply into something like Aquinas' commentary on De Trinitate by Boethius. I mean, that might be a little bit above their realm of accessibility, and it might burn them out and say, well, I don't get this whole theology thing.
Right.
I can even say for myself, when I became Catholic, I loved studying theology and philosophy before, not to the extent that I have at this point in my life, but I had done some reading with Socrates and a little bit of Plato and lots of C.S. Lewis and a bit of G.K. Chesterton, and I started reading the Summa, and I thought, well, I'm never going to understand this. Holy cow. And so it actually discouraged me from reading primary resources for quite a while.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years ago that I started diving back into resources like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And so it can be a danger as well for us to overload ourselves with too many goods that we're not quite fit to handle at this time.
Yeah, even for me in completing my first master's degree, I was reading so much Pope Benedict and John Paul and Thomas, all of these great theologians. And I remember when I was working at my last parish, St. Timothy's, there was a very kind elderly woman who I would talk to, pretty frequently after masses. And she gave me a novel to read. So, make sure you read this novel. And I'm not much of a novel reader. It's just not my kind of thing. And it's like, well, I have so many other things to read. And this was after I had graduated, and I was still reading lots of Benedict and all this stuff. And I got burned out because I was constantly doing theology, and I needed like a mental break for a little while. And so, exactly what you're saying, sometimes Satan can work by getting us to choose a lesser good over a greater good, or overloading us with a lot of great goods so we get burned out. So I think the key is temperance and prudence.
Right. Well, even in that situation, too, we talked about last time having proper use of recreation and leisure. And so what you may have been doing is not giving your mind a time to really enter into leisure when it comes to how you're actively using it.
Right.
Because, I follow the same thing. I haven't read a fiction book in years.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I think I tried to read a book called, Apocalypse or something. It was a book by, I don't remember the name of the book even. That's how long it's been since I even tried to read something that was fiction. But in any case, so Jake, you were talking a little bit earlier. I thought this was interesting. You said no technology in and of itself is either good or evil.
Did you come up with one that's inherently evil on its own?
Can I come up with one that's inherently evil on its own?
Oh, did you?
No, I can't. Even, I guess, nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I thought of that one too.
Could be about the closest thing you could look at, but what if space aliens attack us? You ever see Mars attacked? That could be an issue too, as we think this is our greatest attack.
There's that documentary of Avengers, right?
Yeah.
Where the aliens came and Iron Man helped, and that was a documentary, right?
Of course. It happens every week, actually.
Yeah.
So
seems like it in those movies.
But it's always in New York. It never happens. Nothing happens in Minnesota. I'm so bored. Why can't aliens attack Minnesota for once?
It'd be fun.
We can handle this.
Yeah, I think you and I can handle it on our own.
Yeah,
we'll send Michael after.
That's how it always works anyway.
We'll send your 2-year-old after.
Well, going back to Mars attacks, that's how the military couldn't handle it. And so what they did is they played that, I don't know, was it a Dolly Parton song or whatever, where she sang at a particular note and all their heads exploded?
Perfect.
So there we go. Nuclear weapons, aliens, Dolly Parton.
So is Dolly Parton a technology that's inherently bad or inherently good?
Well, I've never been entirely sure if she's a robot or not. So maybe that's a different show.
We'll have to ask Mitt Romney. He's a robot, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway,
that was interesting.
Yeah, I thought about nuclear weapons too, but again, I think the weapon itself, you could argue that itself is a technology, but what's the technology that went into it? And there's engineering and there's all kinds of sciences. And recently with the chemical attacks in Syria, chemical weapons, I suppose those
what could it be used for?
Right, those would probably be inherently evil. I guess when I was thinking earlier, I was thinking, generally speaking, weapons of war are not inherently evil. It's how you use them. And if you're manufacturing chemical weapons, I would say those are probably inherently evil no matter what. I can't think of a good way of using that.
Well, and I think in the Republic, Socrates talks about the military being something of a necessary evil. It's a good thing to protect our resources and our families and everything. Mm-hmm. But it would be better if we didn't have to. And so when it comes to military weapons like this, there is a licit use for them, and that's protection, which is another whole discussion on just war. But even those weapons themselves, I think, need to be oriented towards humane ends, which sounds a little odd, talking about weapons being oriented towards humane ends. But I mean, when you have this attack in Syria, like you're talking about with the sarin gas, it's just so deadly and painful, and just it is not only something that ends life, but also terrifies a population.
Yeah.
It's something that is I can't even think of illicit use for it. Other than possibly figuring out a way to find an antidote to it or whatever by studying sarin gas, so that way if somebody...
But that's the sarin gas itself. That's
right.
not weaponizing it.
Yeah.
Well, since we're here, why don't we talk a little about just war? Because that just war is an important thing right now. Our world seems like it's constantly at war. But for us to understand the just war theory, I think is an important way of looking at technology and whether or not we're using it for good or for evil or that kind of thing. So we'll add a little philosophy into technology here. If war is necessary, how can we do that in a proper way? For those of you listening, if you have a catechism handy or a computer to look it up, it's paragraph 2309, paragraph 2309. And in the catechism it says, the strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, and then it lists the 4 conditions that are required to make a war just. It says the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. Why don't we just look at President Trump's, I guess you could call it an act of war, firing 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria just a few days ago. So the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. Allegedly, Bashar al-Assad inflicting sarin gas attacks on his own people. Is that damage inflicted lasting, grave, and certain?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's lasting because people died. It's grave because they died in an awful way. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it certainly happened. There's no debating that it happened or not.
Well, and that's one of the other things too. You talk about lasting as well. I mean, that's got to have a serious effect on the psyche of the population.
Oh yeah.
And so, I mean, if you're instilling a culture of fear into the hearts of the people who live in this country, then you're going to have unrest for a long time.
Yeah, that's very true.
And it's only going to continue the chaos and the absolute quagmire that's going on down there politically and culturally speaking.
Right. All other means, so this is the second one, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Now, this one is a little interesting to me because it seems like President Trump didn't look for other means.
Sure.
But if we go back to 2013, I believe it was, President Barack Obama drew a red line in the sand, if you remember this.
Yeah.
There's a red line in the sand, and if you cross it, you're going to feel consequences. Well, Bashar al-Assad crossed that red line back then with chemical weapons, and nothing was done. Mm-hmm. And then there were some sanctions done, and it was reported that from Secretary of State John Kerry that because of Barack Obama, all chemical weapons in Syria, 100% were removed, were given up. Well, now there's new evidence coming out just yesterday or today that the Obama administration knew that they still had chemical weapons. And so nothing was done. So I think with the transition of power to new president right now, it's not necessarily that we can just take the last, President Trump's been in office for about 80 days now. I don't think we can take just the 80 days to say, well, has America looked for other means to end this issue in Syria? I think you have to look at the Syrian conflict as a whole, which goes back to, I think, 2007. Mm-hmm. So all of the means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. I would say at least what we have done in the past has been ineffective. I don't think it's been impractical to use sanctions and things like that. I think that can work, but you have to have a strong leader to make that work. And all you listeners can draw your own conclusion of what I meant by you need to have a strong leader.
You can't fall through like being a strong parent. You tell your kid, don't go over there and do that, and they go and do it. You're like, don't do that again. Don't do that again.
Yeah.
Do it. I take it seriously.
So the third one, there must be serious prospects of success. So what was the goal of President Trump sending 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria?
Well, I think what he was doing there was he was actually launching a strike against a few airfields where the chemical weapons were launched from.
Yep.
And
stored.
And stored. And
yep.
so by doing so, he was making an attempt to eliminate any future attacks. And considering the overwhelming power that we use against these bases, I think that there was a certain high level of success, or a high probability of success, given the parameters of the mission.
And then the last one is the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And so what that says basically is that we can't use chemical weapons or worse in order to end it. We're not going to drop a hydrogen bomb on Syria to end chemical attacks.
Right.
Because that wouldn't be just.
Or it could be like, you could be like saying it's, what's the, there's an old saying, releasing the wolves to catch the cat or something like that. I mean, and you release this wolf into your house because there's a cat that came in, and now you have this wolf in your house you got to deal with. And so what do? You get a bear to chase out the wolf,
right?
And then you get get a bear. Then you get a gorilla. You got two gorillas that come in and chase out the bear. I mean, what are you gonna do?
Yeah,
keeps on escalating.
Yeah, that's very true. Now, as far as just war theory goes, it seems like our attack on Syria was a just act. Whether or not it was valid, licit, or illicit is a whole other question, because President Trump did not go through Congress, which is required by our Constitution. And so maybe in the grand scale, what he did was an appropriate reaction to Syria's Bashar al-Assad attacking his own people with chemical weapons. Whether or not Trump did that by appropriate means according to our own Constitution is a different conversation, I think. But we use this just to illustrate the four marks of just war theory that are supposed to guide our way of conflict in the world. But just as you said, it's better if we don't have conflict at all.
Sure.
But the reality is we do, because we're sinful, and so the church has to provide some way of us knowing the good and the evil ways of going about conflict. So, I know that a lot of moral theology and technology revolves around bioethics.
It does.
So we have a list of a number of bioethical issues, biotechnological issues that we wanted to talk about today. And fortunately or unfortunately for you listeners, we're going to have to cut the show about 5 minutes short today, because John and I are going down to a campground to plan out our extreme faith camp for 200 junior hires and senior hires this summer. And we have to leave just a few minutes prior to show's end. So we'll get through as many of these as we can in the next 25 minutes or so. But if we don't get through them all, maybe we can take just a couple minutes in next week's show before we get to Inter Mirifica in order to finish. Because these are really important for our daily lives, and we get told all the time that these are necessarily good because we have them. And I've made the argument in one of my classes that science has gone the way not of questioning whether or not we should, but whether or not we can. And
just like Jurassic Park.
Yeah. We have Jurassic Park coming. Did you know they're resurrecting the woolly mammoth?
Yeah, I've heard this.
This is frightening.
It is a little bit frightening, but I've always wondered what woolly mammoth tastes like, so maybe we can market them.
Yeah, we could market them. I would be interested in hunting woolly mammoth. In part because I don't even need camouflage with how much facial hair I have. I could just walk up next to them, they wouldn't know the difference.
Well, and besides, last time they were around, I mean, people didn't really have razors or whatever, so they had tons of hair already, and so they'll think they're back home with you around. Neanderthal Jake.
Neanderthal Jake. That is my new name, NJ. All right. So biotechnology, I think the first thing to look at, I try to put these kind of in order of logical reasoning. So I think the first thing to look at is contraception. And I actually draw a parallel between contraception and birth control. And this is one that not a lot of people think about, but I think it's an important thing to talk about. So I don't know, John, if you have some thoughts on it first, on contraception and all of that. Maybe you can walk us through a little bit the church's stance on contraception and why the church has that stance.
Sure. This is actually a doctrine that the church has believed in for a very, very long time. In fact, there's a particular passage. I think it's in 1 Corinthians where Paul more or less says avoid witchcraft, and the word he uses there for witchcraft isn't
pharmakia.
It's pharmakia. There you go. It's pharmakia. And pharmakia mostly referred to drugs that were meant to, or not drugs, but like natural plants and herbs that were meant to prevent birth, to stop conception from happening. And in fact, there was a plant, I forget what it was, but it was so popular in the Roman culture, in the Roman world, that they consumed it to extinction.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even the idea of the pharmakia, which is the Greek that got translated to witchcraft, which I think is a terrible translation, but the taking of the drug or the plant was not necessarily contraception, but rather an abortifacient.
It had that effect as well.
So it wasn't that it would necessarily keep a woman from conceiving, but it would cause a very, very early abortion within the woman because of whatever chemical that plant elicited into the body.
Sure. In either case, they were trying to prevent actually having a child.
Right.
And some of the research I've done on that too, there is a bit of ambiguity between whether or not it was meant to prevent conception in the first place, or if it was meant to end conception, to end actual pregnancy. And they even had other means, like putting moss on the cervix in order to prevent the sperm to actually come through and fertilize. Yeah. Which is shocking that they had that kind of understanding at that time. Yeah. I mean, although we always say those things. I remember having a retreat at my church a couple months ago, and there was a woman who gave a little sermonette during a communion service, and she was talking about the feeding of the 5,000. And she's like, did this really happen? I mean, could they even count to 5,000 back then?
Oh, my goodness.
I know, it was so painful.
No, it's just the Greeks, hundreds of years before that invented mathematics.
Yeah, so big deal. We tend to think ancient people were stupid, but they weren't. They're just as smart as we were, and they didn't have the scientific method in the same sense or framework that we have it. So there was a number of developmental issues that they weren't privy to. But
I've been to Rome 3 times in my life.
Yeah.
And they're driving buses and stuff over bridges that were there in the Roman times. Yeah. The Colosseum stood through 2,000 years of war and earthquakes, and it's still there.
And then here in Minnesota, Highway 100 has been under construction for like 15 years, and they finished it.
How about a couple winters ago when the dome of the Metrodome collapsed under snow, and the Colosseum had a dome too, and that never collapsed.
This is true. Although there's video evidence of a wizard in Wisconsin who was casting curses upon Minnesota at the same time it collapsed. I can show you a video of it later.
Well, never mind. I'm not going to say anything bad about our neighboring state, but the Packers are terrible.
They are.
But so are the Vikings, just for different reasons.
Yeah, mostly because we just can't win.
I'm not a big football fan, so I can admit this, but Minnesota's hatred of the Packers is one of envy, not of actually thinking the Packers are bad, but it's one of great envy, because there's some stat of, in the time Aaron Rodgers has been quarterback of the Packers, the Vikings have had like a dozen quarterbacks. We're just not good. No. Let's be honest.
Not at all. I mean, even think John Randall, who was one of my favorite players when I was in middle school because, believe it or not, I was a defensive lineman, like John Randall.
Yeah.
And he left, and he went to go play for the Panthers or something, and he said, the Vikings are just a bunch of losers, that's why I left. Wow, that was really
That's kind of harsh. And now he's in, like, the Vikings Hall of Fame.
Oh, and yeah, the guy calls them a bunch of losers. Anyway, moving on, contraception. The church has been against it for her entire history. You can find it throughout the various documents in Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, early church. It goes on forever, but one of the biggest, one of the most important documents in the church's history about contraception was Humanae Vitae, which came out in the early 60s against...
1968.
1968, sorry, late 60s, Pope Paul VI, where he talked about why the church is not going to capitulate like almost all of the other Christian churches in terms of accepting contraception as something that's illicit within a marriage.
Yeah.
And he laid out all these different reasons for it, but the primary reason is because it frustrates and works against the natural and principal end of marriage, which, as we've talked about several times before, is the production and rearing of children. And then he also went on to talk about how if contraception becomes widespread in its acceptance and usage, that we're going to see a higher divorce rate. Abortion is going to become not only legal, but considered like a human right. We're going to see the increased objectification of women. Fathers are going to fail at their responsibility of being fathers. And then he talked about we're going to start seeing a whole bunch of other moral atrocities, or moral aberrations, such as gay marriage, bestiality, etc., etc. And he laid all these things out in a way that it makes you wonder if he had a direct line to God.
No kidding.
God was like showing him on a TV screen. These are all the things that are going to happen if the church accepts this.
Yeah.
And he was actually acting against a lot of what a number of theologians at the time were saying.
Well, he put together a council that the council itself was much maligned because he brought together on purpose a bunch of voices from around the globe, from like sexual study institutes and all this stuff, and he purposely put on this council people that were for contraception, for abortion, and things of this nature. And there were publications and things that were excited because they thought that, well, this is a sign that the church is going to change, which is really interesting to me because people get excited about the church changing when they themselves hate the church and disregard what it says anyway. Which I think is proof for the church being divine, because if they don't like the church or they reject the church and yet they want it to change, it's like they're trying to kill further their conscience.
Right.
But this council he put together was much maligned, but the reason he did it was that so he could best understand both sides of the argument. I mean, I really think he was kind of going a St. Thomas Aquinas route and understanding the enemy's position better than even the enemy does.
Right.
And so, they gave their recommendation to Pope Paul VI, and the recommendation was to accept contraception. And, well, as they say, the rest is history. Sure. He greatly condemned it.
And one of the things that I love about Pope Paul VI and really just papal encyclicals in general is that when they write these encyclicals, they're not just mere works of abstract theology, but it is pastoral in its content. And they really take their character after a lot of what Paul does. He talks about theory, but the theory is for the sake of the practice. Which you can see really heavily in Romans, and maybe we can talk about that another day. But Paul VI here says something that I think is absolutely beautiful. He says that love is total, that very special form of personal friendship in which husband and wife generously share everything, allowing no unreasonable exception and not thinking solely of their own convenience. Whoever really loves his partner loves not only for what he receives, but loves that partner for the sake of the partner themselves. Content and to be able to enrich the other with the gift of himself. One of the things that happens with contraception is with the act of your body, you're saying, honey, I love you and I want to give everything to you except this part of myself, my fertility, right. The other way around. Honey, I love everything about you, but you keep your fertility to yourself.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain amount of rejection, a certain amount violation of the unitive aspect of the sex act as well,
mm-hmm.
not only the procreative aspect, because it ends up in being a rejection of the partner.
Right. Well, and what other bodily system would we do this to? I mean, if I'm sitting there looking at a delicious, juicy hamburger, and I say, you know what, hamburger, I love you, but you keep your nutrition to yourself. I mean, what sense does that make? I would be frustrating the end of my nutritive and digestive system. But I just want to sit there and look at the hamburger? That doesn't make any sense.
It's funny, C.S. Lewis, it's a Mere Christianity, he's talking about lust, and it baffles him that, or he asks us to imagine a country where men all get together and they sit on a stage and the curtains come up and there is this grand table with a plate and a cover over the plate, and they slowly reveal to the following of all men to music and song and dance, and then finally at the end it's mutton chops, and then just go absolutely wild for it. I mean, the amount of lust that we have, the insatiable desire for sexual satisfaction and pleasure, it just seems to be so inordinate to its actual end and actual good.
Yeah, and so things like contraception, I think, really try and put sexual disorder into the norm,
right?
And then it's celebrated.
Yep.
But I think if we compare it to other things like food, we see how ridiculous the argument is.
Right.
If we frustrate or we somehow disorder another normal functioning of our human body, we can see how absolutely crazy something like contraception is.
Mm-hmm. Mike Schmitz has a really good discussion on this, on Bruce Jenner and the transgender question.
Yeah.
On his video blog. What's it called? I don't know. That's fine. Ascension Presents. There we go. It's called Ascension Presents. And he says exactly that. When we think about everything else, chopping off my own arm because I don't believe in it, but I don't believe it's actually mine. But the second we say, well, this piece of my body, this genitalia, isn't actually mine, or I actually deserve I need breasts even though I was born a man.
Yeah.
We lose our minds about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's just very interesting how irrational that we're willing to get
right.
when it comes to our own sexuality.
Right.
And so contraception not only violates the procreative aspect of men, of the sexual faculties, but it also violates the unitive aspects. And we start from here, and from this position, this separation of sex from fertility and sex from procreation is the beginning of a number of other issues that we run into throughout.
One thing I do want to make that distinction between contraception and birth control before we move on, because a lot of times we use those terms interchangeably, and I don't think that's really an accurate way of looking at it, because birth control is a broad term. And when we use it, when we seek birth control in an artificial manner, such as contraception, condoms, pills, all kinds of stuff like that, that is when it's wrong, because you're frustrating the natural end of the sex act or of the conjugal act. But birth control sought by natural means, the church actually approves and promotes. And so natural family planning, a huge gift to the church and to married couples everywhere. And this is a great use of biotechnology and biological research of the different ways that we can understand the fertility cycle of a married couple. And I say a married couple because neither the man or woman are actually fully fertile on their own. A man or a woman on their own cannot make a baby. And so it's the fertility of the couple, not of one or the other. And so birth control sought by natural means is promoted by the church, because the church doesn't expect us to propagate children to such a degree that we can't meet their natural needs, which I think is really important to understand too. And I think that's probably what Pope Francis was trying to get at a couple of years ago when he said, you good Catholics don't need to reproduce like bunny rabbits or something. I don't think he quite...
He didn't actually say that. That's the thing. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he didn't quite say that. Yeah,
he made some general comparison or some broad comparison to rabbits.
Right.
But it wasn't a direct correlation.
Sure.
But I think what he's really getting at is that, we need to see all children as a blessing, and we also need to make sure that we as husband and wife are seeking to provide emotionally, financially, spiritually, intellectually for our children. And if we have, 10 children in 10 years, that's going to be very difficult.
Yep.
One
part of that too, if I remember the context surrounding it in the meeting. I don't remember the exact words that he said, but I know that the intention behind it for him was, at least in part, to help the church understand that a good Catholic family isn't necessarily one with 10 children.
Right.
But it is entirely possible for there to be a very good Catholic family with only 2 children, and that this is especially the case if that family isn't able to conceive, and that we shouldn't look at Catholic couples who have smaller families as somehow deficient or somehow violating the Church's teachings on marriage and reproduction. Because it might not be entirely their fault, for one. They might not have the financial means, like you were saying, to take care of those 8 children. But it is up to the individual couple to discern the number of children that they can reasonably take care of and that God actually desires them to have in their own lives. Granted, God will provide. God always provides the means necessary to carry out whatever mission He's called you to on your path of life. But you don't need to have 1,000 children in order to be a good Catholic.
Right. That's important to understand, too. So the Church does promote natural means of birth control. However, even these means, such as natural family planning, are not meant to be used with a contraceptive mentality. Right. And so really I guess one way of looking at it isn't just to say, like, okay, is this a good time for us to have another baby? Well, the reality is it's never a good time for that.
No, there's not.
But I think the more proper question to ask is there a reason for us not to have a child right now? Perhaps spouses are between jobs, or you don't have a health care plan, or you just had a baby 6 months ago, and it's just probably not a good time to have a baby. And so...
Or one thing that people often do is they'll say, our marriage is a relationship of suffering, and so a baby's going to make it better. I can tell you this much. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
What happens, like, the same thing when you get married, the issues that you had before that were good get better, and the issues you had before that were bad get a little bit worse. It's the same way with having a baby. If you have some major issues in your relationship before you have the baby, they're going to get worse. If you have some really good things going in your relationship, they tend to get better. That's at least from my experience. Granted, I've only had one child. He's only been around for a little over 20 months now. But regardless, that's what I've seen in my own life, and it's also what I've seen in the lives of others as well.
Yeah, we have. Time flies when you're having fun. We have just about 6 or 7 minutes left for today, and we've gotten through one. So why don't we just jump into in vitro fertilization? Well, why don't we take the life issues? We're going to talk about in vitro fertilization, prenatal diagnostics, embryonic stem cell research, and abortion, and also the death penalty. I think the death penalty one should be pretty easy to go through right now, because I want to be able to give good time to the other ones, because there's such big issues in the world today. So
there's a lot of confusion about the death penalty too within the Catholic world too.
Yeah, there is. So why don't we look at the death penalty and wrap up for today?
Certainly.
And then next week we'll talk about these other life issues in terms of technology and morality, and then get into intermorifica, which is on the proper use of social media. But the death penalty, which I have found very fascinating. And I think you're right, Studi, that there's a lot of confusion within the Catholic world even on whether the death penalty is good, evil, indifferent, whatever. And I think some clarification is very necessary. And so the death penalty has not always been... well, let me put it this way. The death penalty has never, to my knowledge, been inherently approved or condemned as good or evil. The Church has seen it as something that is possibly a legitimate way of dealing with heinous criminals. But I think if we start with John Paul II, I'm just looking for the quote here. In his work Evangelium Vitae,
56.
Paragraph 56, he talks about it. I don't want to go through the whole thing because it's John Paul II and it's long, but he quotes the Catechism of the Catholic Church where it says, "If bloodless means are sufficient to defend human lives against an aggressor and to protect public order and the safety of persons, public authority must limit itself to such means because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person." I think sometimes people take that quote and where he says public authority must limit itself to such means, they take that and run with it as if to say that John Paul said that the death penalty is always wrong. And that's not what he was saying. What he actually wrote in the paragraph preceding that, so it's the second paragraph of Article 56, he says, "It is clear that for these purposes to be achieved, the nature and extent of the punishment must be carefully evaluated and decided upon, and ought not go to the extreme of executing the offender except in cases of absolute necessity. In other words, when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. Today, however, as a result of steady improvements in the organization of the penal system, such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent." So he's saying there's a place for it,
right?
But in reality today, it probably shouldn't be that common.
Particularly in the West, where we have at least more control or more supervision over our penal system. But at the same time, a lot of bad stuff happens in jails, and so the question is, if you have somebody who is an absolutely depraved murderer who's bent on killing everyone he has a chance to, including guards or other inmates, and there seems to be no way to control this person, even through solitary confinement, because in that situation they're even a danger to themselves. Although that's a different situation either, but when solitary confinement would be for a long period of time would be a just form of
because that's pretty cruel and unusual.
It's cruel and unusual, and it deprives people of real good, which is interaction with others. And so that in itself isn't a good thing either. But the main issue is it's almost like extended self-defense of the society. So it's self-defense of the person, and so even if the person is a serious danger to the guards and to the other inmates, then it might be the case that this is a situation where we can look into the death penalty.
And I think one of the keys here is that if the death penalty is sought merely as retribution, then I would argue it's probably necessarily wrong, because we can't fall into Hammurabi's code of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so it can't simply be sought as strict retribution. What also needs to be considered, at least in my opinion, in reading John Paul II, is whether or not there's a legitimate and real opportunity to keep this person from doing more damage to society. And if there is not that opportunity or that possibility, then the penal code has a right. It doesn't have to exercise it, but it has a right to exercise the death penalty in such a case because of what you were saying. It's self-defense of the society. In the West, I think you're right, John, that it's probably pretty non-existent here. And you and I were talking about this last week, I think, that perhaps a place like in the Middle East or Africa or the Far East, whatever, maybe their jail system can't hold heinous criminals. And so the death penalty might be more common there. But then the converse side is that usually there's a society that has a poor jail system, then the justice system, there's a good chance is corrupt too, and you might be executing innocent people.
Right.
More common.
Yeah, that's one of the other issues too, is being sure that you've got the right guy. I mean, even in times in recent history where somebody, who was it? There was a man who was accused and convicted of a murder in the late 1980s, and then he was recently exonerated of all charges, and he was just kind of released back in society.
Was that on? Was that the Netflix special?
It might
Making a Murderer.
No,
or whatever?
no, that one's a mixed bag of nuts. That's a political quagmire right there.
Okay.
That's a different issue. If I remember correctly, my wife watched that, and she was telling me about it. The guy was accused of murdering, I think it was his wife, and then he got out of jail, and then he was convicted again, and it kind of seemed like the county had some sort of vendetta against him. And then it turns out there was more evidence than we originally supposed. Anyway, it's gone back and forth. And last I heard, the guy was back on trial for murder again. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but this is a different case. This was another man. I don't remember who it was, but in either case, he had spent 20, 30 years in jail.
Yeah.
For being unjustly convicted of this crime of murder.
Right.
And then he was recently exonerated of that because of DNA evidence that they were able to look back and reopen his case. And he was let go. And he's happy to be free, but he's rather unhappy that he now has 30 years of jail time experience on his resume.
Right.
So what is he going to do next?
Yeah, that's a huge thing too.
As well.
So anyway, the death penalty, I think I've recently heard a priest say it's always and necessarily evil, and I just don't think it can be that simple because there's a lot that goes into something like a justice system and a penal system, and people are capable of doing grave and heinous things, and those same people have broken out of prisons before. So I think it would be wrong simply to advocate for the death penalty to always be available, but it's also wrong to completely eliminate it from options that the penal system has. I think the key is that the penal system has to be pretty uncorrupt. And, if we look at the statute outside of the Supreme Court, that needs to be accurate. Lady Justice is blind. You need to just look at the facts and only the facts and not confuse those with all kinds of other things.
Well, I mean, I think Socrates using the city as an analogy for the soul, in a sense, works both ways. When it comes to my own life and the protection of my children, as somebody who's practiced self-defense for 12, 15 years, I want to keep the lethal options open in my mind, in case that's the only thing I can do in order to save my own life or save the life of another innocent. And in that situation, I look at that, and of course I would want to do everything I could to avoid killing somebody. But if it is the case that it's the only means possible or expedient to saving innocent life, and that's what I'm going to do. If I need to, I'm not going to like it. And hopefully I won't fall too much into regret, although from every case I've ever heard of somebody killing another in self-defense, there is an element of regret in that.
Yeah, well, you question your decision-making. But again, it goes back to the circumstance that you're under duress and that kind of thing. Well, we are out of time. Next week we'll get more into biotechnology and different moral means of technology as well. Also, we'll talk about Inter Mirifica and the Church's document on the proper use of social media. We do have an email address now, so if you want to send your comments, your questions, your concerns, your love, whatever, your great approval or disapproval of the show. Encouragements. We definitely need encouragements because
it's all okay.
We work for the church, so please send encouragements as well. But if something has come up or we haven't clarified something well, then please do send us an email. That email address is lostvoice@wcatradio.com. Lostvoice@wcatradio.com. So please send your questions and concerns, and John and I will answer those quickly and to the best of our ability. And if we don't have the answer, then we'll find somebody who does. We both know great priests in the area.
Yes, and we absolutely love, we talk a lot about what Jake and I are interested in and what we think people need to hear about, but sometimes it's the case that we miss that. And so please tell us what you want to hear about, what you want to know about your own Catholic faith, about the world as it is. and what we're seeing in our culture, and how classical theology and philosophy can shed light on and heal the issues in the darkness of our culture.
Yes, so send your questions to Lost Voice at wcatradio.com. This is Jacob Nelson signing off for this week along with Jonathan Studi. Have a blessed Easter in the Lord. God bless.
Goodbye, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.